So when Kanye got up to speak, no one was expecting anything other than the same. But what the world got was a startling truth. He said, "I hate the way they portray us in media. If you see a black family, it says they're looting. You see a white family, it says they're looking for food. And you know it's been 5 days because most of the people are black. And even for me to complain about it, I would be a hypocrite because I've tried to turn away from the TV. It's too hard to watch. But they've given them permission to go down and shoot us." His co-presenter, Mike Myers, scrambled to salvage the script. But Wes wasn't finished. Still physically shaking, he would go down and say the words that most people would remember. "George Bush doesn't care about black people." It was a simple phrase and a sentiment that had been expressed in many black households, including mine, and barbershops before that night. Black pessimism was the highest it had been in at least a decade.
The things that we're going to be talking about today are concerned with, again, how do things that begin in the fringe move to the mainstream? And so I'll give you an example of understanding this from our perspective. One of the things that we have to tackle when we look at media manipulation campaigns is, what are the functional uses of media manipulation? What function might conspiracy serve in our everyday lives? So most of us throughout our lives have heard some kind of conspiracy around there's something in the water, right? There's been horror movies about there's something in the water. There's been studies where people have gone out and said, there's problems with the fluoride. There's too much fluoride in the water. Sometimes conspiracies have a kernel of truth to them. If you're an InfoWars listener, though, when you hear there's something in the water, you might then leap to the conclusion that it's turning the frogs gay. That's a joke. Come on, guys. It's funny.
I kind of did it I was like...
Yeah, but that's how a conspiracy theory might start out, as having sort of some kind of general quality, but then if you're a listener of this newsworthy individual, Alex Jones, and InfoWars, you would know that the logical conclusion to that, based on his point of view, is that it's turning the frogs gay. However, if you were to shift focus and look through the lens of another community where people in Flint might say there's something in the water, right? It's not so funny anymore, right? Because we are now dealing with something that does have a kernel of truth, has those qualities of all of those conspiracies that we've thought about before, but then activists have to actually jump over that other hurdle or overcome another obstacle to get you to believe them. And our research tends to go into understanding, well, how do people end up getting believed online? How do these things that move from, one tiny community into the broader public? And so with Brandi's research, we're trying to understand, well, what are the cultural vulnerabilities, or what are the hurdles do activists have to move through in order to explain that there is, in fact, something in the water? And so her presentation today is going to have us thinking through, well, what are some of these conspiracies that are popping up in pop culture? Who are the people that are carrying them into the mainstream? And then how are different political opportunities manifest through the carrying of these conspiracy theories from one community into another? All the while really trying to take a step back in a kind of overview approach to saying, well, let's not dismiss conspiracy theories. Let's not just dismiss this and say, oh, well, we've heard that before. Other people claim there's something in the water. This must be a lie. We, as a team at Shorenstein, really have to take careful consideration to understand the perspectives and the context in which these conspiracy theories travel, and then situate them culturally, and then understand what kind of opportunities they make for other kinds of actors in this world. So that was a long way around of saying that Brandi's work has been integral in getting us to think differently about, well, why do we think in particular ways about Black voters? Why do we think in particular ways about Black MAGA even? And what can a more heterogeneous view of Black political expression bring to our understanding of disinformation and the possibilities for media manipulation. So with that, I kick it over.
So I'm gonna start this presentation with telling you a story that maybe feels familiar, but I want to offer the thought that maybe how we remember it was wrong or absent a certain context. So how many people remember Hurricane Katrina and where you were? How many people were alive in 2005? Okay, cool. Yeah. Just checking. Because I'm definitely being confronted with age on this campus. But one of the most iconic visuals of the 21st century occurred on September 2nd, 2005. And that was the day that Kanye West would go down in infamy for calling out the racist systems failing Hurricane Katrina during a nationally televised benefit relief concert. For over a week prior, Katrina had wreaked havoc on the Gulf Coast. But the tragedy wasn't purely in the downpour itself, a natural disaster intensified by climate change, but in the dizzying levels of poor decision-making before and after the storm. Decisions involving everything from underinvestment in infrastructure to over-policing to shoddy reporting. The documented results include the destruction of over 200,000 homes, massive economic and forced physical dislocation for a disproportionately high number of Black and poor people, and the loss of nearly 2,000 lives, but really the full-scale effects won't ever be calculated. Photographs showed mostly Black people on their roofs trying to make their way to the New Orleans Superdome begging for help. The day before the benefit concert, New Orleans police officers shot 6 unarmed residents in the city, killing 2 of them. The officers were later found guilty of conspiring to make the shootings appear justified by planting a gun, fabricating witnesses, and falsifying reports. That same day, September 1st, Roland J. Bourgeois gunned down 3 Black men attempting to seek refuge after Hurricane Katrina. He used racial epithets before the attack, telling one neighbor, "Anything coming up the street darker than a brown paper bag is getting shot." While these instances were widely covered by Black media, it was underreported in mainstream media. Twitter didn't exist. Both Facebook and YouTube were less than 2 years old. Nevertheless, conspiracy theories picked up steam in Black households from north to south. The levees were bombed, people said. It was part of an anti-Black effort to whitewash one of America's most popular travel destinations. Up until the Kanye moment, the benefit concert, much like media, had shied away from explicitly addressing race, instead choosing to frame it as a universal expression of grief and mourning. But the anger, the sadness, the loss and the pain weren't universal. Black and poor people were literally being gunned down or left to die, and everyone seemed content to leave this an indictment of environmental or Republican federal policies and not the direct result of racist systems and decision-making. Even the call to action, money for Red Cross relief efforts, was a trite gesture. It was like putting a Band-Aid on a brain hemorrhage. So when Kanye got up to speak, no one was expecting anything other than the same. But what the world got was a startling truth. He said, "I hate the way they portray us in media. If you see a Black family, it says they're looting. You see a white family, it says they're looking for food. And you know it's been 5 days because most of the people are Black. And even for me to complain about it, I would be a hypocrite because I've tried to turn away from the TV. It's too hard to watch. But they've given them permission to go down and shoot us." His co-presenter, Mike Myers, scrambled to salvage the script. But West wasn't finished. Still physically shaking, he would go down and say the words that most people would remember. "George Bush doesn't care about Black people." It was a simple phrase and a sentiment that had been expressed in many Black households, including mine, and barbershops before that night. Black pessimism was the highest it had been in at least a decade, with 82% of African Americans believing racial equity would not happen in their lifetime, a number that had dropped to 47% the year President Obama ended up being elected. That research comes from Michael Dawson, who's had one of the most robust bodies of work looking at Black political identity. But few people, regardless of race, were prepared to hear the kind of whispered musings of Black folks openly vocalized while so many were watching. The soundbite would later replay over and over again, not just in the US, but around the world. An organization I would go on to work for, Color of Change, would launch in the immediate aftermath. Our first member email blasted the subject line, "Kanye was right." We had T-shirts. We went all in. It's a little hard to wear those T-shirts now in some spaces, but we were fully committed at that time. And the call to action was to support a new Black political agenda for corporate government and media accountability. Academics would widely credit Katrina, the Gen 6, also in Louisiana, Troy Davis, and the subsequent murders as Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and Michael Brown some years later as the start of the Black digital civil rights revolution in the U.S. It's hard to think about Kanye now, though, without mixing in all the episodes that have become standing jokes now. So you think about Taylor Swift-gate, Megamania, the incredibly bizarre Bound 2 video, which if you haven't seen, it's not good. You should watch the Seth Rogen version instead. But for those who were there and can remember, try to go back to that moment. He was a rising star, to be sure, but he hadn't quite reached these kind of like icon levels. His lyrics and beat sample selection drew from high-low cultural themes of Black folk traditions and identity, and the lasting effects of institutional racism, as well as the experiences of middle-class modern Black life in Chicago and across the U.S. And I want to kind of like pause here and talk a little bit about hip-hop, because I think, for a lot of folks, they're especially those that don't listen or consume hip-hop, you think about it in a certain way. But Chuck D once said that hip-hop is the Black CNN, and in many ways it was and is, Drake notwithstanding. Similar, he's Canadian. Actually, I love my Canadian people. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Similar to the way folk and punk music spoke to a disaffected generation, grappling with what they saw in the world and how that wasn't reflected in mainstream media and frames. It wasn't just about the lyrics. It was an entire aesthetic. Think about sort of Woody Guthrie walking around with his guitar painted with the words, "This machine kills fascists." Hip-hop speaks to Black life in all its complexities, and hip-hop is for the culture. How many people have heard that term? For the culture. Okay, some of y'all. So I tried to look up the origins of For the Culture last night. This is a statement that speaks to the ways in which we as Black people carry out actions and carry our identity for the benefit of our shared culture. According to the internet, it was invented by the Migos, which I'm pretty sure is not right. I know it's not right, but I think, again, it speaks to the way in which this term has been sort of adopted and pushed by hip-hop culture, and the ways in which different music, even that doesn't seem like explicitly political, carries this sort of through line of what are we doing for the culture. I'll come back to that later, but to turn back to Kanye, he certainly wasn't overtly political, like groups like Public Enemy or Tupac. Most of his lyrics did talk about how Black people relate to each other and within racist systems. And while he wasn't without controversy, at this time, his music is kind of like that frat house hip hop that you could play in your campus. You could seem cool, but then it kind of had jazz inflected beats that your mom was kind of like, ooh, I like this. He wore sort of pop collar polos. He cracked the top 10 talking about Jesus. His album titles and themes charted his personal bootstraps narrative from dropout to graduate, playing around with this idea of Black excellence while maintaining street credibility. He was credited with officially shifting hip-hop away from gangster rap and helping to usher in a new era of danceable pop-hop. I have thoughts about that, but we'll leave that there for now. So when Kanye West, the person Time magazine had recently anointed the smartest man in pop music, was picked to join the Hurricane benefit concert, in a lot of ways it was a safe choice. But that moment in the minds of many would mark kind of like the beginnings of him becoming a villain, a role he would both relish and seem to struggle with in coming years. For Black people, he was for the culture. In the moment of the minds of many, that would mark the beginnings of sort of the political evolution or devolution, depending on who you ask, of Kanye West. And I think people kind of talk about that as like two different Kanyes, but I think part of what he's reflecting is this sort of evolution or the nuance of Black political identity. Part of why it's so hard for Black people or for people generally to understand how he could go from issuing an indictment of the head of the Republican Party to becoming a poster child for conservative Black nationalism is because Black political identity in mainstream white-owned media is often depicted as a monolith. There's little to no daylight between Black politics and the Democratic Party. It's taken for granted that Black people are the highest voting bloc for the Democratic Party because the party reflects the values and thoughts of Black people, when the reality is far more nuanced than that. So looking at a couple of shifts in how Black party affiliation has moved. So this chart is from 1936, but prior to 1936, Black voters held deep loyalties to the party of Lincoln. Professor Leah Reitberger outlines this in her book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican. One of the quotes she uses is this: "The Republican Party, mused an African-American voter in the 1930s, is a party for all, regardless of race, color, or creed." Added another: "It was good enough for my father, and it's good enough for me. My politics is like my religion. I never change, and I'm careful about serving my Lord and voting the Republican ticket," which is another thing to note. Like, Black people are actually the most religious ethnic group in the U.S. by a fairly significant margin. 94% of Black people believe in God with a fair amount of certainty and describe themselves as having some level of religion. The next closest group is Latinx people, which I think is like 82%, and then it kind of like drops from there. But this combination of sort of religion and politics and how that's lived within Black political organizing and spirit is one that's extended for a long time. So in this point, and it still extends to now. So according to a study from 2012, 47% of Black people identified as being on the liberal spectrum, while 45% identified as being on the conservative spectrum. These tensions have kind of been held around this idea that when you look at sort of traditional Black conservatism or progressivism, all of it is held in this idea of what we're doing for the culture, so this idea of racial egalitarianism. So traditional Black conservatism has talked about economic independence, free of certain safety nets, but always as a pathway to equity. And so in understanding that, we say the monolith voting pattern of Black communities, 90% of Black voters cast a vote for Hillary. We understand that the Black center, though, as it stands firmly in the Democratic Party, is more a direct result of failures of white leftists to sustain relationships with Black radicals and the outright racial hostility of white conservatives who jumped full on into the Southern strategy with dramatic gusto. And so we understand the Black center is mainly a defense mechanism for Black survival. So what happens when that becomes undone? And you kind of see the evolution again with Roosevelt coming in. He introduces the New Deal, which had major impacts for the Black community. And that actually, between his first term and his second term, he shifted Black votes at a really large level. And then by the time Nixon comes in, and you see this embrace of the sort of like Southern Democrat and converting them to Republicans, and the perception that the Black political agenda is being abandoned by the Republican Party, that's when you start to see this like political shift that explains how we get to today. So turning back to Kanye, when Kanye says George Bush doesn't care about Black people, I would submit he wasn't talking in the frame of party affiliation or political identity. He was really expressing a broader sentiment that government at the highest levels doesn't care about Black people, regardless of political party. Contextualized in that way, Kanye's recent fervent support for Trump becomes less about switching party allegiances so much as it becomes grasping for some sign that oppressive political structures can be upended and derailed. After all, Trump is the change the rules president. And for some, the idea of a change the rules president is seductive. He is a man of limited knowledge and unlimited power. And he does what he wants. He marries models. He flosses like he's in a throwback Bad Boy video. And that way he's sort of, in many ways, embodies the kind of American capitalist dream. And like Kanye, Trump is a conspiracy theorist. So Kanye plays around with themes of like Black genocide. Some folks have said his song Blood on the Leaves is in some ways a commentary on abortion, mirroring billboards that popped up in Black communities attacking Planned Parenthood that said the most dangerous place for a Black child is in the womb. Those, by the way, were put up by Black pastors who have pushed the Black MAGA ideology. He also references the Illuminati. And Trump becomes an obvious figure for him to gravitate to because they speak the same language. They regularly push ideas that run counter to media narratives. Trump, when challenged by mainstream media, is quick to paint them as a danger to society. And his subversion of media also reflects the sentiment of Black communities, which for a long time have seen the mainstream media as not reflecting our issues, our stories. or not reflecting them in truth. Kanye for years has rapped about toxic media forces. One of his lyrics proclaims, "The media wants to crucify me like they did Christ. They want to find me not breathing like they find Mike," referring to Michael Jackson. And perhaps some of these different elements of what Trump is saying is part of the reason and why what he's saying is resonating not just for Kanye, but for others. At last polling count, I saw that Trump is growing in popularity, particularly amongst Black men, with current approval ratings higher than any Republican in recent memory. But this project is not really meant to be an indictment of Kanye or an effort to cape for the Democratic Party. I'm using Kanye's biography as an allegory and tracing the kind of evolution of Black political identity and expression of identity through cultural product, as well as to highlight the ways in which historically politically diverse Black-owned and controlled cultural spaces have provided sanctuary against bad information in the ways those are being compromised now. So this is essentially the kind of like rubric or graphic or whatever you want to call it that I'm working with. And I'm looking at, how cultural spaces on and offline have provided constructive ways to process the psychosocial trauma of systemic racism. Black religious institutions, newspapers, and businesses have offered refuge from American mainstream media narratives which exploit and downplay the trauma of Black communities. In my research, I argue that alternative framing, rumor, and conspiracism has historically functioned to protect our communities against external manipulation. Joan talked about this a little bit, right? Like, don't drink the water because there's something in the water. And if you're in Flint and Oakland and other communities, there is something in the water. I argue that today, the corporate consolidation of communication technology and failures of platform companies have left marginalized people particularly susceptible to the Trojan horse of right-wing funded disinformation campaigns and foreign interference. With special attention to alternative spaces of communication online, analysis of the state of Black contemporary press, I'm trying to make the case for the importance of independent community media in fighting voter disenfranchisement, economic inequality, and disinformation. And so part of my journey starts at looking at the existence and the state of Black technoculture, which is at the heart of this sort of networked factions piece that you see up here. So looking at the ways in which cultural power is built, and particularly how it's built online. So this interplay between the sort of virtual beauty and barbershop, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but in other places, we're talking about kind of like various message boards where certain conversations are coming up. Folks here might be familiar with 4chan, which has been a place for a lot of messaging for certain like right-wing, alt-right thinking. Then you see in how it kind of like moves into like bringing in key storytellers who are able to like move those narratives and kind of like amplify them. And then you see the rapid spread of them on saturation distribution networks. And so really, when I talk about the barbershop, which I'll come back to, I'm talking about this like concept of Black technoculture. Technoculture broadly refers to the interactions between and the politics of technology and culture. Professor Andre Brock, another academic favorite of mine, talks about this in the context of Black people. He says, for him and his research, the pressing concern for Black technoculture is to address the question of how to manifest the vitality and joy of Black uses of information and communication technologies while recognizing the possibility for emancipation through radical, decolonized, or appropriate digital practices. Professor Catherine Knight-Steele also speaks to this concept and introduced me to the concept of the virtual beauty or barbershop. And she talks about, the barbershop as a place where, as a safe space in order to form and sustain sort of political and quasi-political discourse. And that part of what we've seen online in a number of different platforms and places is, especially in absence of some of the physical spaces where some of those conversations would often happen, is that they've like moved online. And when they've moved online, they've become a little bit more open to like public consumption in a number of ways that can be both powerful but also undermining. So here's where the rubber hits the road. Because Silicon Valley, and this is when I go into like my diatribe about Silicon Valley that I give in every speech, so you may have heard it before if you've heard me speak, but I'll do it again. Silicon Valley has created an on-to-offline world premised on the idea of human engagement, but built on bricks of radical individualism absent a human rights framework. So contrary to the predominant belief that Silicon Valley is inherently liberal, anyone who has been to Silicon Valley has probably found it hard to ignore Ayn Rand's influence. How many folks here are familiar with Ayn Rand? We'll talk a little bit about her. So if you manage to find a bookstore in Silicon Valley, and it really is true, I was going to take all the photographs of it, the top 10 recommended books will always have either Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged. And there are a number of startups with references to her and her work in the name. And CEOs like Jack Dorsey and several others have talked about her as a major influence. Now, Mark Zuckerberg, Lasso, he says Augustus is his influence. So you can take that for what you will. But Ayn Rand talks about what she calls objectivism. So in essence, that unfettered self-interest is good and altruism is destructive. So in Silicon Valley, the primary goal is to work towards a society with no hierarchy, where everyone makes their own decisions fueled by self-interest. But because everyone is linked by the machines and the global network, they feel like from that would come a stability, a subconscious consensus that builds a new world order, a new democracy that renders nation states irrelevant, and any form of regulation or control a danger to the utopian network formation we should be striving for. And while those in Silicon Valley fancy themselves rule breakers challenging the status quo, what we've seen clearly is that the computer systems and the global networks created have not redistributed power. It shifted it and concentrated it in new forms. The power is exercised over individuals in a variety of ways that have implications across all areas of life. And what makes it particularly scary is that it's not a place where people's labor is exploited for product. People are now, in fact, the product. And it's human interactions, desires, and emotions that are commodified. So looking at 2016, the US and how race and ethnicity was used to undermine democracy. One of the most shared articles of 2016 was from Michelle Alexander. So how many people here are familiar with Michelle Alexander? More than like most rooms I go into, I'll tell you that. Most people aren't. I wouldn't have, in fact, were it not for the fact that I got my start in criminal justice and was doing the work when she released The New Jim Crow, which is a book in which she talks about how the incarceration system replaced slavery as a place for like sort of free and exploited Black labor. So in 2015, during the Democratic primaries, Professor Michelle Alexander wrote an article about the Clintons. And at this point, we're still in the Democratic primaries, so a lot is coming out about Bernie Sanders and the way that he's being undermined by the Democratic apparatus. But also, there's this kind of like galvanizing around the Clintons as these people that have sort of like been, you know, for the culture, I guess you could say. People have always joked and called Clinton our first Black president. So she drops this article and she talks about the ways in which the Clintons passed and championed policies like the crime bill and other neoliberal policies and welfare reform that ultimately did massive harm to Black America. And her article would have normally been read by a very small group of people. But what she didn't know is that the fix was kind of in, so to speak, and her words would be weaponized as a tool of voter suppression by encouraging Black voters to sit out of the election. At the time I saw that her article was the third most read article at the time, I didn't fully know what I was looking at. I just knew it wasn't right. And later I would find out that more than 66% of Facebook adverts posted by Russian troll farms contained terms related to race. African American voters were openly discouraged from voting and from supporting Hillary Clinton. And we saw that reflected in the Black voter turnout, which had been steadily increasing pre-Obama, but in that year actually decreased, and Black millennials were the only millennial group who saw their vote drop. So now you have this marginalized group of people fighting for equity and liberation and freedom in service of some form of egalitarianism, organizing on platforms which were not built and meant for that. And so you can imagine how these things may not turn out well. The thing that makes us safe is the thing that runs counter to Silicon Valley's DNA. And then there's this: marginalized communities have fought globally to be heard and to participate fully in shaping our democracy and economy in whatever way that looks like. Much of that has meant organizing out loud in highly visible ways. Most of us do not want to be anonymous or forgotten. On the contrary, we want to be seen in all our infinite complexities and humanities. And it's not necessarily that we don't want privacy. Black people are more likely than any other group in the US to read the terms of service. But we don't want to be preyed on, silenced, or disenfranchised by corporations and government. And so we have this tension or this fight that's like between how do we use these platforms to like get free and operate for the culture, and what does that mean when the platforms are not built for the culture. And so I want to close by kind of leaving us with this graphic. And so this is comes from, can y'all read that? Should I read it? So nearly 1 in 5 Black potential voters do not view the Democratic Party favorably. And 52% of potential Black voters do not believe that any members of government care about the Black political agenda. And so this is taken from the Black Census Project, which was helmed up by Alicia Garza and her crew. Transparently, Color Change also supported. And this was gathered from data from 30,000 Black people in the country. And so to put that in context, the average poll has about 1,000 people in it. And that you need 1,000 to get to a margin error plus or minus 3%. You need a margin error, you need 10,000 people to get to margin error plus or minus 1%. So 30% of Black voters, I would say, is a like fairly accurate representation, and it spans political viewpoint, age, and is in almost all 50 states. And so when we look at this and when we see where Black pessimism is, what do you have? What is the equation when you take sort of Black pessimism, unchecked platforms, a pop culture icon that pushes conspiracy theory? Well, we'll find out in 2020. But I think, in reading the leaves, there's a lot of work to be done on the organizing and misinformation front. So I'll close there, but I want to thank all the researchers who've done amazing research and have been super generous with their time. I've been blown away in my time here of the body of sort of Black researchers, not just at Harvard, but around the country, where I've like cold called them and reached out to, and they've like donated their time to talk to me. I've named a few, but I also would like to name Professor Anthea Butler, who talked to me about religion and political identity, and Professor Patricia Turner, who talked about conspiracy theory. I want to give much thanks to Joan, Brian, I'm not going to say his last name because he hates that, and Jackson Miller, who's been my RA while we've been here, and the folks at the Kennedy School have been helping me kind of kick the tires on this. So I'll close there.
Thank you so much. As a sociologist, I really love a presentation like that, which gives us a story that invites us all in to rethink a moment in history that we're all very familiar with, but we didn't quite understand the implications of until we start to read it through broader trends in voting, as well as in the way in which we think about how people think about politics, right? Which is to say that in the U.S. we have a representative democracy, so you have to have some kind of faith that the person you are voting for wants you to survive till tomorrow, at least, right? The day after the voting, at least. And I think revisiting key political moments through the life of, or through the biographies of certain people like Kanye can help us understand what other kind of representatives that might there be out there that can help us understand and get a window into the culture. And so one of the things that I would love for us to talk about is to think through this moment in Kanye's political expression. So we have a new album very much influenced by what appears at least to be like religious culture and not just a kind of another manifestation of his aggrandizement of himself as potentially God or Jesus. But I would love for you to let us talk to us a little bit more about what you're seeing in the moments around his Sunday services, as well as this way in which he's using social media in order to bring what are ostensibly political rallies to different college campuses under the guise of Sunday morning, preacher.
So one of the reasons why I locked in on Kanye as a figure is there's a number of different reasons. One, he's like sort of in my generation, maybe a little bit older, but is from Chicago where I grew up. He grew up in a lot of the like spaces in which I actually navigated. And for those kind of like unfamiliar with Chicago, it's a very like segregated city, or historically it's been. And so within a 10-mile radius, growing up in Chicago, you would have like the headquarters of the Nation of Islam. You would have a whole cluster of like Black Catholic churches, the largest like AME Black church in the city, Rainbow Push, which is like Jesse Jackson's outfit. And you would also have like where the sort of historic Black record labels existed, and you would have a lot of like sort of Black businesses and institutions all concentrated within this radius in which Kanye would have grown up. And his mother also was a professor at Chicago State, which is not a historically Black college, but it's been debated whether it should become one. It has always been kind of like rooted in the Black community in Chicago. And so he grows up in this space, right, where he has a lot of like physical presence around him for Black political organizing, and he's highly influenced by his mother and his father, who's like was a photojournalist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and so he comes up in kind of this life and space. But like part of what you've seen in his biography, and that's also part of the reason why I want to track it, is sort of the erasure of some of those institutions around him, whether it's like the death of his mother, the loss of these certain communities or relationships that sort of held him down and had him sort of tethered to the culture. And I think when you look at his different lyrics and how he cycles through these different phases, which is part of what we're looking at, I'm so excited to do a lit review on Kanye's lyrics. But you see him sort of grappling with how does he find his place? How does he find his identity? How does he find his power as these institutions and people are sort of leaving him? And so now you get to these Sunday services, and again you see Trump, and part of the allegory and a huge turning point for Kanye is actually his rejection, his very public rejection by President Obama. So this like major Black figure, leader of the free world from Chicago, who should be embracing a big star from Chicago theoretically, like not only repeatedly kind of rejects him, but like gets caught on a hot mic calling him a jackass, so kind of almost like publicly embarrasses him in these different ways. And so then you lose that tether to maybe this party that he felt like he actually was down for at a certain point. And then you enter Trump. And so part of what I think you're seeing Kanye grapple with is like how do we recreate these institutions that have failed him. And so part of the reason why I have this lyric up here is that you see a lot of people talking about what's for the culture. And Kanye, both in his recent lyrical content and in interviews that he's been doing, has said he's not for the culture, that he was canceled before cancel culture. So now the culture is corrupt and he's trying to form a new culture. And I think that's very much what you see in these Sunday services. You see them using imagery from like sort of different rallies, but you almost see him recreating this concept of the Black church, but having it kind of like centered around him and around his kind of ideology, and then pushing out these sort of Black genocide and a number of different other narratives that we see coming through in his lyrical content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from our perspective as well, as we're trying to think about media manipulation, in 2016, a lot of people were saying, oh, well, the impact of these disinformation campaigns, Russia pretending to be Black Lives Matter, we can't understand the influence of that, and we can't understand that, and then we had this whole sort of tired moment where everybody was like, well, it must all just be bots. It's nobody listening to anything. It's all bots. The bots are spamming bots. It's computers talking to computers. How can we know that pushing memes about political apathy or pushing memes about the Democratic Party being like woefully inadequate, how can we know that any of that had an impact? And Zuckerberg comes out and says, essentially right after the elections, the idea that fake news, quote unquote, changed anything is crazy, right? And in and of itself, the idea that social media changed the culture is treated as a conspiracy theory at first, right? Until people have to go back with proof, and you have to go back with proof, and you have to go back with more proof. Then you get in front of Congress, and then Congress is like, what's a Facebook? I don't even know how to turn this computer on, right? And so you get into these moments where you have to constantly, and I think Black activists especially are constantly being told the proof you have of this thing isn't enough. The thing that you think is happening isn't happening. Like there's this constant gaslighting by especially politicians who say, well, at the end of the day, we can't know what mattered, or we can't know where these ideas come from, or we can't know if Black apathy is an artifact of just the kind of moment, the historical moment we were in 2016, or if in fact there was some like large-scale Illuminati plot, right? Like there's just these poles, and nowhere in the middle are there any kind of gradations that try to understand that even if Black people are putting together cogent arguments that are grounded in truth to say that there's something wrong with the representative ways in which we do government in the United States, people would dismiss that and say, oh, that's just Russian propaganda, right? So there's no room for legitimate grievance at the same time that it's more important than ever that people are able to understand what is a truth and a lie, even if it is something that's the discourse is something that's happening online, because it does show up in our everyday lives. And so one of the things I'd love to understand from your perspective as a political organizer is, how do you, and this is a little bit different from what we discussed, but I want to talk about the digital beauty shop, the digital barber shop. Like, how do you turn ideas from what might be considered liminal spaces or fringe spaces online? How do you understand what might be important about that for political organizing? Like, if you can understand the perspective of someone that is believes that no government can represent them, like, how do you move them into a space where not just that they would vote, but that they would start to organize for their own survival?
Okay, so there's a few things, and then I'm going to try to land the plane. But I think to take a couple of steps back, I think one of the things that we've talked about that I think is important to note about Russian influence is that I think a lot of people don't fully understand, one, the depths of the ways in which Russian influence has been wielded over Black people currently and historically, but also why Black people would be singled out. And so I feel the need to just say that, like, this has been something that's been happening for actually like 100 years, going back to the early 20th century. Russia actually invested $400,000, something like that, which would be the equivalent of like millions today, in Russia propaganda targeting Black people in the U.S. And that was part of what they saw as key to, they saw Black people as a very powerful lever in undermining capitalism and toppling the U.S. And so, and even when I talked to Patricia Turner, she talked about in the 1980s, there was a conspiracy theory floating around that was talking about that the U.S. was developing these sort of like ethnic murder nuclear weapons that were only targeting Black people. And I asked her, because her book that I read came out in the early 90s, well, what did she make of that? And she said she didn't, and she wished she had, but she didn't understand how barber shops in communities how Russians were able to infiltrate barber shops and hand out pamphlets that were sort of forwarding this messaging. And then she also noted that law enforcement knew about it going back to the early 80s, but did nothing about it. And so, like, part of what we're seeing with Russia is born out of like years of refining the technique. And yet we cannot forget that voter suppression is very much homegrown. It doesn't need to exist in Russia. It doesn't solely exist in Russia. We've seen, far right-wing factions leverage the platforms quite well, which like takes me to part of when I'm looking at Kanye's allegory is part of what I'm looking at is his intersection with Candace Owens, who is a Black right-wing commentator. And she plays around with things of like resurfacing this term democratic plantation, which actually goes back pretty far. It was first used by a Black conservative whose name escapes me, but then was picked up by Richard Nixon, and has now had this kind of like resurgence versus Candace Owens. But like her biography is also interesting as well, because she's somebody that comes from like a background at first being like a social justice feminist journalist who felt sort of like rejected by that community and then got uplifted by Gamergate. So you have this person who is kind of like coming up through the system, and just like Black people are the earliest adopters, some of the earliest adopters of new technology. Gamers and white nationalists are also some of the early adopters of new technology. So you have people kind of like playing around with this, and then you have her leveraging those platforms well, and then having this engagement with Kanye. And then you see Kanye taking those terms, like, again, taking a niche figure, Candace Owens, who would be known by like relatively few, who's talking about democratic plantations and that Black people are slaves that need to get off the democratic plantation. And then you get to Kanye talking about no more for the culture, I'm nobody's slave, like taking that term and popularizing it for people. And so that's the ways in which we're seeing the kind of like culture move. And in some of these like public spaces, you know, we talk about these like virtual barbershops, but they're not real. When I go to my beauty salon and I'm talking to my hairstylist for like the 20 hours it takes for her to do my hair, no matter what hairstyle I'm getting, like the things that I'm saying in those conversations are not necessarily the things that I'm saying for public consumption. But when you go into platforms like Twitter and you add in those kind of like performative aspects of it and who's observing that and then how is that being leveraged, that leaves us open to a certain weaponization. And even we're finding in these sort of more closed platforms and message boards like Lipstick Alley, which I don't know how many folks are familiar with Lipstick Alley, but it's mainly consumed by Black women, and 4chan calls it like the 4chan for angry Black women. So take that for what you will. But I'm a 10-year subscriber, by the way. But like you're seeing these places which normally would have a veneer of safety when they're physically in communities, being places where people are grappling with conspiracy theories, with certain terms, with quasi-political ideology. But now you have this like invisible layer of observers who are able to take that information and leverage it and exploit it in a number of different ways. I might have just rambled for 3 minutes, but hopefully I answered part.
No, it makes sense to me. And one of the things that I think social media adds that wasn't available in that moment when Kanye was saying that George Bush doesn't care about Black people is that feedback loop that online provides, which is to say that there's a kind of fork in attention. One is this validating effect that goes back to the influencer, the storyteller, or the newsworthy individual, where it's like literally like on Medium, it's hand claps, right? Or on Twitter, it's retweets and likes, or, not replies in that sense, but you get this instant sort of gratification of saying, oh, I said this thing and there's a lot of people that agree with me. And then if you're a newsworthy individual, it does this other thing as well, which is amplifies those ideas and makes them in some ways like political footballs. Like people then can kind of make do with them, and it provides these different political opportunities that most people wouldn't otherwise have. And I think that we could have done a research study that told a very different story using like Beyonce's like culture and musical career combined with all of the ways in which that has allowed her to become political in very specific ways, and ways in which celebrity allows people to have different political representation, and we do oftentimes, unfortunately, in many cases, we're inclined to believe a celebrity because they've already made their money and whatnot, and so their politics seem to be a bit, in many respects, objective, and then in other cases, people will be like, well, they're just getting into politics because they've got to stay relevant, right? And so there's ways in which we could use this method to tell different stories about Black political expression and how it manifests in representational politics. But I think there's something very new about the way in which social media changes that game, which is to say that Kanye West can exist without mainstream media attention now because he has built an entire networked community around him that will validate and support different, not just like buy his albums, but also validate and support different ideas that he has. And even if he's, not acceptable as sort of a leading Democrat figure, he's still someone who's very he's someone who can expose people to different political ideas in a massive way. So I want to open up for potentially maybe 2 questions. We'll take the questions at the same time, and then Brandi can kind of parse and answer.
So I have several, but I guess I'll just choose one. How do you deal with that lopsidedness of having people like Kanye kind of, just getting all these messages from the fringes to the masses, and where do you intervene, or where do you, you're political activists or people who are more interested in, not spreading these kind of messages that are coming from the fringes, but, kind of encouraging people to vote, or, whatever is your objective?
We have time for another one in the back. Thanks.
Thank you. This is really great. I've learned a lot. So one of the solutions that you outlined to the problem of like mainstream media not covering a lot of things, and so people searching elsewhere, is that we need more independent Black media. What would you say to some people who would say the other solution is also that the mainstream media just needs to like cover Black issues?
Part of what we're dealing with, and this is part of the reason why is I'm like, I think if people are necessarily expecting me to condemn Kanye, and I don't, I have a little bit of judgment, but I see how he gets to like where he is in some ways, and I believe that what is missing are like institutions that entertain or that where all sort of various Black political identities can operate in one space. And part of why a Kanye is able to be successful, like the distinction between Candace Owens and Kanye, they're using the same language, they're using the same concepts. I believe fundamentally they have different end games. I think that like Candace Owens, there's a performativeness to what she's talking about and what she's doing that's a little different. And an example that comes to me is like she actually interviewed Steve Bannon a couple months ago, and it was a YouTube video. They're sitting in front of the wall because, cute optics, right? And like they're debating on like the direction of sort of the tech industry. And Steve Bannon, and this is a race to the bottom, by the way. I'm not saying that either one of them are great, but Steve Bannon says like, the issue is that we have all of these technologists that are coming from other countries and then coming here, and they're building the tools on which we engage. And we should actually, instead of investing in tech workers from outside of the U.S., we should go to Ferguson, or we should go to Baltimore, we should go to these other places and invest in Black technologists because they want to improve themselves. And Candace Owens says, no, they don't. Black people actually don't want to improve themselves. They're happy with being where they are. You should look towards like Nigeria or other places. And so even though she's like putting forward this like nationalist, Pan-Africanist veneer, have you, like her end game ultimately is a little bit different. Whereas I think with Kanye, whether or not he feels like he's for the culture, or he feels like he's been canceled for the culture, I think he still is operating in some sort of service of like Black equity. And he's talking about things that are real. So Joan talked about this, like when you talk about the issues of health and incarceration and inequality in our communities and disappointment with the way that parties have shown up for us, those are real things. So as an organizer doing Black political organizing, I don't know that my goal is necessary to push people into the Democratic Party versus who are the candidates and who are the people that are actually like centering and surfacing the Black political agenda, and how do we push those that aren't to be held accountable to us in different ways, and how do we deal with like a party that places more value in this sort of like white right-wing independent vote than the Black votes that have been for them for several years. And so part of it is around like that canonizing and that organizing both of political figures and of our own community to still like, you know, show up, but to force 365 accountability. And so that's the model that we work from. And in terms of this idea of like, I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think that's part of the reason why I spend so much of my time banging my head against the wall, meeting with Facebook and these other companies, and also trying to like speak to mainstream media, because we can't escape them. Like mainstream media still is king. Most people at home still watch local news. 2.2 billion people are still on Facebook. So if we aren't working to like reform and shape and impact and influence those spaces, we're still gonna lose. But the danger is in just leaving our fates to those places exclusively. Like we have to still also push, and I'm not even just saying this for Black people, I'm saying generally for all of our sanity and safety and well-being. We have to push for like sort of alternative sources of digital sanctuary and safety.
On that note, I want to say thank you again to Brandi Collins-Dexter for coming and talking to us today, as well as thank you again for your fellowship. We're still learning a lot, and hopefully there'll be a paper that we can circulate to you in the coming months. Yes. That's the promise. Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all.